Donc, si je comprends bien,
If I understand well, today I'm going to try to give some impulse with no intelligence.
la deuxième partie
The second part will be actually easier than the first one.
remarks prompted by this intensive morning, for which I congratulate Nicolas Berggruen for his initiative, as well as Frédéric Mion and Sciences Po for their hospitality. Throughout the morning, beginning with the important and forward-looking speech of President Hollande, the fil rouge, the overriding political concern, has been unemployment, youth unemployment in particular, and what to do about it. I think it was encouraging to see the great deal of focus, much greater than on previous circumstances, it seems to me, that national governments and European authorities are now concentrating on this issue, unemployment and youth unemployment. First remark I would like to make in this context has to do with the economic and political culture. That is, the way that public opinion sees or does not see a link between unemployment and budgetary discipline. I think I'm rather well placed to say a few words on this because I come from a country which, of course, is even more than others affected by high unemployment rate, high youth unemployment rate, and certainly more than others has had to cope in the last couple of years or so with a very intensive care to come back into budgetary and fiscal discipline, which I'm glad to say should be certified tomorrow by the European Commission, which is about to abrogate the excessive deficit procedure for Italy, which it entered in 2009, whereas the same procedure is kept alive for a number of countries, which include countries ordinarily considered of a higher league than Italy as to budgetary discipline, such as France and the Netherlands. So, in my view, there is a very important link, first of all, that in terms of economic and political culture, people do not see between unemployment, youth unemployment, and budgetary discipline. If we ask ourselves why is it that unemployment in Europe, particularly in certain countries, and youth unemployment are so high today, I think this has a lot to do with the lack of budgetary discipline in the far past. After all, before the euro was invented and put in place, and with it a whole battery of constraints in order to put some discipline into budgets of member states, many of those member states used to incur into very high deficits, which of course accumulated public sector debt year after year. It has become almost a stereotype to say, but it is true, that that was transferring burdens onto future generations. But then we tend to forget that future generations actually come to life, and I think to a very high extent the burden shifted from the 70s, the 80s, the early 90s into the future generation is now hitting the current generations by paralyzing much of the economic policy potential of governments because they have, in many countries, very, very high public debt to GDP ratio. And in some countries, still very high government annual deficit to GDP ratio. So before we come to the conclusion that budgetary discipline is always conflicting, as in the public opinion is very frequent with employment and youth employment, I think it's good to make this point about the past fiscal indiscipline and current unemployment and youth unemployment. Far from me to pretend that that is the only reason for the currently high rate of unemployment, but certainly it has a lot to do with that. So if we had had the much hated Maastricht Treaty and Stability Pact a few decades before we got them, maybe today unemployment and youth unemployment would be lower, not higher. This lends itself to a subsidiary remark on whether what is cast in stone in a treaty is unchangeable or not before a new treaty is put forward. I think the construction of economic and monetary union, of which we have here with us today the greatest architect, Jacques Delors, had to be somewhat rigid and had to be even somewhat oversimplified, almost dull at the very beginning, because the primary objective was to persuade public opinions in Germany, the Netherlands, and other strong currency countries that there was no big risk in one day sharing one currency with people from the south, often considered slightly less responsible, at least in the fiscal area. And then, of course, there were a few changes introduced into the Maastricht Treaty, the Stability Pact, then this whole unpronounceable generation of pacts, the six-pack, the two-pack, the fiscal compact, really not a public relations or clarity exercise, but after all extremely forceful in keeping a modified version of discipline going on. By the way, even in very, very unchangeable things in theory, like the relationship between politics and central banking, very important developments are possible. One occurred almost without great reactions in the midst of last year, when the unanimous adoption by the heads of states and governments in the European Council of June of a statement that excessive instability of interest rates in government bond markets, even for so-called virtuous countries, was posing a problem which was of a European nature, was the political prerequisite that gave comfort to the totally independent European Central Bank and its president to modify to some extent the doctrine, as was said this morning, and to go into a mode that created a new type of intervention, which has not really been practiced yet, but by the mere fact of being there as a potentiality has calmed down financial markets very, very much. In relation to the how people see the link between unemployment and budgetary discipline, I see a very interesting aspect of that link as seen in Italy now, for example, again, by the political world's attitude as this day of Italy's exiting the excessive deficit procedure approaches, because it is seen by some not as a date confirming that a difficult but productive path has been gone through that now puts Italy in a much more stable position, which benefits which will no doubt come in terms of further reductions in interest rates. But this is seen almost as the moment of going out of a prison, a newfound liberty, almost as if it were, which definitely it is not, an admission by Europe that Europe had been too tight. Now, coming out of the excessive deficit procedure is prompting many discussions on new ways of spending money, as if there were no longer constraints on the budget. So this will take, in the countries of the south of Europe, which are evolving into a more stable budgetary situation, I think, an issue of adjusting culture, and that is of coming to the, I believe, correct view, but not obvious for the great public, that budgetary discipline pays, and that certain things, like now in the case of Italy again, the payment of debt of the public administration to companies now will be possible, is being possible since a few weeks, precisely because as the country goes out of this hyper-surveillance position, some more margins of flexibility are officially allowed by the EU. I think it's very, very important in the next phase of economic policies in Europe to educate people to the fact that having observed some fiscal discipline and virtues was not a forced tribute paid to gods residing in a more northern part of Europe, but was, after all, correct economic behavior. But Northern Europe, in my view, has to give something as well. And that is the deeper realization of the role of investments in economic activity. Again, because the Maastricht Treaty had to be somewhat rough and easy to be understood to reassure the public opinion, it didn't really make a difference between consumption public expenditure and investment public expenditure. And since that day, since 1996, 1997, when the Stability Pact was created, I think we have all too much neglected this distinction. The fact that it is very difficult to distinguish in practice on specific investments, whether they are real productive investments or pseudo investments, like when the government covers expenditures of a state-owned companies, the fact that there may be statistical identification problems, in my view, but we have many times discussed with distinguished members of this audience, like Professor Ottmar Issing, this issue. In my view, this is not a good reason to then say, because it is difficult to understand what is really a good productive investment done by the public sector, let's assume that all investment done by the public sector are like consumption, do not have an economic merit of their own. And I think that now, as this is my perception at least, I live intellectually in a sense on the Alps, because I feel as a translator of the virtues of discipline into Mediterranean languages, one of them in particular, but at the same time as an interpreter of some rightly felt difficulties of Southern Europe towards the more Nordic countries. I think that it is important that as Southern Europe is becoming more attuned to the requirements of the social market economy in all its respects, including the public sector discipline, it's important that the northern part, and Germany in particular, evolves as well in terms of abandoning some simplistic views, and, for example, not forgetting that in the original German constitution there was the golden rule clearly distinguishing between public sector consumption and investment. And now that the South is behaving more properly and is I mean, not that the North by definition is virtuous. Of course, the first big threat to the Stability Pact was inflicted subtly and jointly by Germany and France in 2003. But let's assume that the South is less virtuous than the North. And at this time that the South is, after many efforts, aligning a bit more itself with the conceptions of Central and Northern Europe, we can see that Germany, the European Commission, the European Council are now ready, it seems to me. It took a lot of pressure, but they are now ready to apply some degrees of measured, modest, controlled, supervised flexibility. And now countries that leave the corrective arm of the Stability Pact and enter into, therefore, the preventive arm, this will be, as of tomorrow, the case of my country, may be granted some limited flexibility, for example, for productive public investments. One point that I would like to make, because it has come up many times in the morning, leaving now budgetary deficits, is about structural reforms. It has been underlined by the politicians on the first panel, of course by the President himself, but by ministers on the first panel, and then by everybody under different angles. And here I would like to say that if we take on some sort of a political economy approach to structural reforms and compare them with what needs to be done for budgetary deficits, I don't know whether there is a theory on this, but my very pragmatic observation, also from direct experience, is that after all, for a government in a member state of the EU and of the Eurozone, it is more difficult to do proper structural reforms like in the labor market, like introducing more competition and so forth, than it is to become fiscally disciplined. And we see a number of countries that have been making more progress in recent years in adjusting their budgets than in going toughly into the deep of structural reforms, although this has now come to be recognized as a top priority because we all now realize that competitiveness is the name of the game. Why do we in general see better results in coping with fiscal indiscipline than as regards structural reforms? I've come myself to the conclusion that this is due to two factors. One, so far, no, let's start from the internal one. The government versus organized interest groups game, government versus lobbies, is more difficult when you hit specific interests of organized categories of business, of professionals, of public sector employees, because their ability to organize and to oppose the measures is well known. And budgetary measures, at least some of them, like certain increases in taxation, are more general. Of course, they hit people, but they do not hit people in a very great measure, as sometimes it is the case for structural reforms that want to inject more competition in a market, therefore wiping out rents from certain categories. So it is more difficult. And you get less help from Europe. This is the second element, because all the armamentaire, all the instrumentary of Europe and of the EMU has been focused initially on obtaining budgetary discipline. That is why the constraints, the fines, the monitoring and all that has been so far stronger for that part of the work of a government. So if you meet with even stronger difficulties in structural reforms, and if you get less push from Europe than you do on budgetary consolidation, then the likelihood is that you go less ahead. That is why I welcome very much the recent reorientation of the EU policy line, certainly not away from fiscal discipline, but to give more and more importance to country-specific recommendations in the areas of structural reforms. And unlike, I understand from Sylvie Goulard, for example, that the European Parliament is not very fond, not very happy about the notion of contractual arrangements between the EU and individual member states as regards structural reforms. My position when I was a member of the European Council was that that's a very good idea, because it would strengthen the hand of the EU on governments, that is, indirectly strengthen the hands of governments relative to organized lobbies domestically, so as to achieve structural reforms. There was one risky and distortive mentality around the table of the Council when somebody started speaking about contractual arrangements, that some countries, once again, thought, what a great idea, let's now, after the Stability Pact, the Six-Pack, the Two-Pack, the Fiscal Compact, let's also add contractual arrangements to make us Europeans extra sure that everybody will comply to the last cent to budgetary requirements. I was among those who reacted, saying, but we cannot always give the idea that we do not believe in rules that we decide and implement, and the Commission implements. If we have these 4 or 5 layers of protection necessary as to how to achieve fiscal discipline, we cannot create a further one as if all the rest was floated around. But contractual arrangements as they are emerging now, geared on structural reforms, seem to me to be a good idea. The last but one remark I would like to make is, this has come up in various points of the morning's presentations, the old friend, but never really never really becoming an adult, although it is old, the single market, which is there, but is pretty elusive and in some areas is not really there. And for example, it came out clearly that we have not a constant, but an increasing fragmentation as regards the single market for financial and banking services. And how this poses problems also to unemployment and youth unemployment. And also another aspect of the still unfulfilled single market concerns labor mobility. And this has a lot to do with youth unemployment. We always say, well, in the US, one way besides fiscal transfers to cope with asymmetric shocks is the high degree of labor mobility. But in Europe, we do not have that high degree of labor mobility, not only because we have linguistic and cultural differences more than in the US, but also because we maintain a number of well-kept and wished-for obstacles that are created by the different, again, categories of professions, of lobbies, etc. And it's really a paradox to observe that within the Eurozone, there is normally less mobility of factors of production, labor in the first place, than there is in the non-Eurozone member states, which leaves a lot to be desired. And this is true for labor and for services in general. For services, and for industrial services, to use a category that Peter Löscher introduced in the economic debate a couple of years ago, I think. And all this would help a lot to have a higher perfection in the single market for services, for industrial services, for labor. This would help a lot to cope with unemployment and youth unemployment, and one hopes that, in particular after the German elections, Germany goes further, much further, in the liberalization of its own large domestic market for services, which would provide a stimulus also to the rest of the European economy. And the very last observation I would like to make has to do with the short-termism of much of policy making in Europe. I think even at the EU level, which is in itself more oriented towards the longer term in the policy-making decisions and less exposed to electoral pressures and cycles, the short term often prevails, and paradoxically, not only the short-termism, which is so diffused, so widespread at the national level, but also the short-termism of mind, in a sense. My experience with the European Council has been brief, 18 months, but I've been impressed by the scarcity of political discussion at the European Council. One would expect, especially if one comes from La Provence, like a professor, one would expect the great politicians to discuss politics. This is not the case. This is not the case. We spent hours of day and night to discuss, the heads of state and governments, they pretend to discuss things that their finance ministers know enormously better than they do. And they have some intellectual difficulties in putting themselves in the shoes of their finance ministers. I was a latecomer, but I had the immense superiority during 6 months of being both head of government and finance minister. So not that I knew more than my upper colleagues, but I arrived to those meetings after I have dealt with those topics already at the level of the ECOFIN. But hours and hours about things that are important, but could be left to a greater extent to the finance ministers, and never a discussion on populism and European integration, the topic that is probably the most serious threat against European integration, how to articulate EU policies and the presentation of those policies, the narrative, so as to not to become victims of populism. But here we arrive at topics of governance, and so this provides a nice transition to the happy choice made by Nicholas Berggren about the name of the Institute of Governance. And this shows also in a concentration of reflections. We had last night the presentation of Nathan Gardel's book on governance, East and West, and we will, in the afternoon, with Sylvie Goulart, have a brief discussion, for which I thank Nicolas, on our book on La démocratie en Europe. And this means that more and more there is an appetite for going beyond the specific policy issues and to discuss the political aspects of governance at the national level, but also in the European Union. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci, Monsieur Monti.
Thank you, Mr. Monti. We shall now break for lunch, and we'll meet again at 2:30 with a very rich afternoon. We'll have a debate on upcoming European elections, populism and election, then a dialogue between Jacques Delors and Felipe González on reforms and growth, together with Mario Monti and Sylvie Goulart, and a dialogue, of course, with some of the students who are representatives here of major European grandes écoles. So we'll meet again at 2:30, please.